We are now going to talk about compliance. Now, compliance is an important topic when we talk about the lungs. So there are some important principles and concepts that we want to derive from this topic for the exam. First of all, let's define compliance. When you hear the word compliance, what comes to your mind? Let me start off by asking a question. If you are to compare the compliance of the lung of a 1-year-old and the lung of a 60-year-old, all things being normal, who would you say have the greater compliance? 1-year-old, 60-year-old. Have you made a choice? Who would you say have the greater compliance? Well, let's see if you're correct. Let's delve into the subject matter and explain what is compliance. Compliance is defined as being equal to change in volume over change in pressure, delta V over delta P. We can say, in other words, change in volume per pressure. Therefore, compliance is proportional to change in volume. The key concept here that compliance is proportional to change in volume. In other words, change in volume is inverse to elasticity. Now let me pause there. This term elasticity, we need to understand it well. Normally when people think of elasticity, they think of stretch. And a rubber band, it stretches. But is that elasticity? Not really. Elasticity is the ability to recoil, to come back when stretched. So it's not the stretch that is really the function of elasticity, but the recoil when stretched. So therefore, change is inverse to elasticity. What do we mean by that? The more elasticity you have, the less change you will have. Why? Because you will come back to the original size or volume with elasticity. Let me give you a classic example. When I was a young kid of about 6 or 7, one of my favorite candy was toffee. Toffee, you know what's toffee? You've enjoyed toffee as a kid, even up to now you do, like I do. Toffee, I used to love toffee. You know why? As a 6-year-old kid, all I have to do to get more toffee is stretch it. It looks more. I stretch it and lo and behold, I have more toffee. Guess what? My toffee could stretch, but it never came back. So is my toffee elastic? Not really. It stretched, but it never came back. Should one day my toffee come back, it's no longer toffee, it's rubber. So therefore, elasticity is the ability to come back when stretched. Therefore, we can conclude that compliance is inverse to elasticity. The more elasticity you have, the less compliance you will have. Now, we compared the lung of a 1-year-old to the lung of a 60-year-old. What was your choice? Well, who's got more elasticity in his lung? The 1-year-old. That's a new lung. We said all other things being normal. So therefore, the one with the more elasticity will have less compliance. The 60-year-old will be expected, wear and tear, would have eventual loss of elasticity as you age. So the 60-year-old is expected to have a greater compliance. Now, elasticity. Elasticity is recoil. Compliance, therefore, is inverse to recoil. What are the recoil forces in the lung? There are basically two general forces that explains recoil. Recoil can be due to surface tension force, or explained by Laplace law. Laplace law. Of course, elasticity can also be due to the inherent fiber of elastin. So elastin, the tissue, also plays a role. And in the lung, whenever we say elastin as a tissue pathology, we should think of alpha-1 antitrypsin, which is what is deficient in patient with emphysema. In other words, they have a problem with the elastin fiber in their lung. Recoil force, we said, or recoil is determined by two forces, surface tension and Laplace law. What is surface tension force? Surface tension force, this occurs whenever we have a liquid air interface. What do we mean by that? Wherever air and water meets at that surface, there is a force called surface tension force. And this force serves to collapse. It's a collapsing force. Civil engineers, when they are learning to build bridges across lakes or ships, where the pillars or the posts enter the water, air and water is meeting at the water line, there is a force called surface tension force. If you're having a huge structure with a large diameter, that force can be very large. So civil engineers will have to learn how to calculate that surface tension force and to reinforce the structure at the point of the water line against the inherent collapsing nature of surface tension force. Do we have surface tension force in our lung? Well, why not? If we look at our alveoli, very microscopic, but the membrane is very friable, very soft. And our alveoli are lined with a layer of moisture. And within the alveolus is air. So once again, in our alveolus, we have an air-liquid interface. And because we have this air-liquid interface, according to the laws of physics, my alveolus is microscopic and the wall is so soft, this force is enough to collapse the alveolus. So according to the laws of physics and surface tension force, my alveoli are supposed to be in a state of collapse. The fact that they are not is against these laws of physics. Now, Laplace law. What is Laplace law? To explain Laplace law, remember when you were a kid, about 6 years old, you loved to go to the supermarket with your mom, and remember at the checkout counter, there at the level of, just at your eye level, they have those shelves. And one of the things they always have there that catches your eye is that bottle of soap sud that you can blow bubbles with. Remember how you used to give your mother hell to get you one of those bottles of soap sud? You will scream and stamp your feet on the floor until she submits and buy you a bottle of soap sud. Now you are in sud heaven as you leave the store, blowing bubbles in the air. Remember those days? Remember the first time you made a double bubble? Yes, a double bubble. You shrieked with ecstasy as you saw your double bubble floating in the air. You brought pandemonium to the parking lot. Everything had to come to a standstill because you were jumping and screaming at the top of your voice. You were in bubble heaven as you made your double bubble as it floated in the sky. You also notice as this double bubble floated in the sky, it became slowly a single bubble before it fell to the ground and burst and dissipate. And that has always challenged your curiosity. Remember, you want to know, why did your double bubble become a single bubble? That night you couldn't sleep, you tossed and turned, agonizing over that mystery of why the double bubble becomes a single bubble. The next day in kindergarten, you ask your friends, why is the double bubble turning into a single bubble? And no one knew the answer. At that time in kindergarten, everyone knew everything about life. You want to know how a baby is born? They will tell you there in kindergarten. But they couldn't answer the question, why does a double bubble become a single bubble before it falls to the ground or before it bursts? So that night, you decided to research, entered the study whilst your parents were asleep, turned on their computer, and you typed in double bubble. All sorts of things appear on that computer, remember? Things your mother would not want you to see. But you were very focused and you scrolled down. And there was the answer. You saw. When we have a double bubble, invariably the bubble are not of the same size. They vary in sizes. And then the answer came as it further explains. According to Laplace law, pressure is inverse to radius. Now it comes clear as you put Laplace law to practice. The bubble with the smaller radius will have the larger pressure, and the bubble with the larger radius will have the smaller pressure. And because they are connected, I now have a pressure gradient, and air moves from the small bubble to the large bubble, thereby collapsing the small bubble and now emptying into the large bubble. So you have solved the mystery of the double bubble. Now, you came to medical school and you are studying the alveoli, and you suddenly realize it's the same concept with the alveoli as in the double bubble, because in our alveoli, in our lung, our alveoli are invariably connected, and they are not of the same sizes, just like my double bubble. So what happens in the small alveoli with the small radius? They have a greater pressure when compared to the larger alveoli with a smaller pressure. Therefore, according to Mr. Laplace, air will move from high to low pressure. Air will now empty from the small alveoli into the large alveoli, resulting in the eventual collapse of the small alveoli. Therefore, according to Mr. Laplace, our small alveoli that are connected to larger alveoli should naturally collapse. This is the impact of Laplace law on the collapse of the lung. When it empties into the large alveoli, we are now increasing surface tension force in the large alveoli, and this should eventually now collapse. And this explains to a large extent why the natural state of the lung is to be in a state of collapse. Now, in addition to the elasticity and the elastin fiber and these forces at work, the fetal lung is able to be kept in a collapsed state during that phase of fetal development. Now, why does the lung expand? 2 to 3 weeks before birth, something dramatic and magical occur. Type 2 pneumocytes in the lung starts to synthesize something very magical. What is that something? That's right, surfactant. Surfactant. Surfactant is the knight in shining armor that comes right in, slaying the evil forces of surface tension and Laplace, rescuing the lung from collapse. So, for the exam, we need to know what is the role or the roles of surfactant? How does surfactant prevent the collapse of the lung? What does it do? What are the properties of surfactant? I know you've memorized surfactant deficiency will lead to respiratory distress syndrome. Yes, but the step one would ask, which of the following is not a characteristic or a property of surfactant? We need to understand surfactant's role. First, surfactant decreases surface tension force by interceding between the liquid-air interface. Therefore, surfactant will increase compliance by decreasing the collapsing ability of the lung. Secondly, surfactant opposes Laplace law or Laplace effect on alveoli, especially the small alveoli. In other words, it stabilizes the small alveoli. And third, we can say that surfactant decreases capillary filtration force. Capillary filtration force. These are the three important functions of surfactant. What does this mean then? It means that if the child is born deficient of surfactant, of course, we call that condition respiratory distress syndrome. How do we go about diagnosing this condition? The diagnosis of this condition definitely depends on an LS, lecithin sphingomyelin ratio, that is less than 2. A lecithin sphingomyelin ratio that is less than 2. So therefore, what would you expect? What would you expect the symptoms of RDS to be now that we understand what is surfactant? As you can see, we don't need to memorize symptoms. If we know what surfactant can do, we can anticipate the symptoms. 1, we'll expect this child to have inspiratory difficulty. Why? Because the child is dealing with a collapsed lung. So it's very difficult to inflate the lung. Secondly, we will expect this child to have an increase in surface tension force. Therefore, this child will have quite a decrease in compliance. This will now lead to atelectasis. This child is at risk to have generalized collapse of his or her alveoli, to atelectasis. And it's not very difficult to anticipate because of the effect of surfactant on capillary filtration force. This child is expected to develop pulmonary edema. Pulmonary, why? This child is expected for the pulmonary edema, wheezes and gargles in the lung, because of an increase in capillary filtration force. Capillary filtration force. So therefore, it's very easy for us to anticipate some of the symptoms that can occur in terms of compliance. Now, we understand compliance from the point of view of its definition. Let's take a graphical look at compliance. If we are to plot a graph of compliance, what will that graph of compliance look like? And here is a graph I want you to look at to show and depict compliance in a normal lung. This line represents the normal compliance in a lung. Note in this graph, we are plotting lung volume against pressure, intrapleural pressure. Whenever we plot lung volume against intrapleural pressure, the resultant graph is called the compliance graph. Now the exam can ask, what is the compliance in this curve? How do we calculate from this curve compliance? Remember, we said that compliance is equal to change in volume over change in pressure. Now remember your statistics now and your math. Compliance, therefore, is equal to the slope of the curve. What do we mean by slope of the curve? Compliance, therefore, is equal to R. We can say that compliance is R. R is slope. And you remember how to calculate slope. Slope is calculated as rise over run. What do we mean by rise over run? Another simple way, A over B. Let's look at the slope, rise over run. We take any 2 points that represent the steepest part of this graph, steepest slope of the graph, any 2 points. So let's select these 2 points. And we now look for the rise. This is called a rise. In other words, this is A, from 1 to approximately 1.5, whatever that is. And the run is, we come down to the volume axis of the 2 points. This is the run. In other words, this is B. So therefore, compliance is A over B. Compliance is A over B. So therefore, in this graph, we can see we will take from this point to this point. Let's call that 600 mils. And we are going from -5 to -8. Let's call that a difference of 3. So therefore, the compliance, therefore, is equal to 200 cm, 200 units or cm water compliance. A very simple calculation. Just remember, rise over run. A over B. Principle, find the steepest part of the slope. Take any 2 convenient points on the slope. Then extrapolate to the volume, that's delta V. Extrapolate to the pressure, that's delta P. And now compliance is change in volume over change in pressure. Sometimes in the exam, they can give us graphs. Now that we understand the graph, if we put intrapleural pressure here and we put lung volume, and if this represents normal lung volume, suppose I insert some graph and I call this A, B, C. And I ask which, if N represents normal, if N represents the normal compliance in a normal lung, which graph would you choose to represent normal aging? Which graph would you represent to choose a person with emphysema? A person with RDS? A person with atelectasis? Let's go through this one by one. In any sigmoid graph, and I'll refer you back to the graph we used to calculate. In any sigmoid graph, not just compliance, wherever there is a sigmoid graph, what do we mean by sigmoid? Moving from left to right, proportional graph. Here is the concept. As you move to the left, you are going to increase. And as you move to the right, you are decreasing. So moving this curve to the left increases the slope. Moving the curve to the right, decreasing the slope. So we are increasing slope, and decreasing slope. Of course, we said that slope is equal to compliance. So therefore, moving to the left, we increase compliance. Moving to the right, we decrease compliance. With that in mind now, what will you choose to be normal aging of a patient? Normal aging of the patient. As you age, what happens to compliance? You are losing elasticity, so therefore compliance will increase. So the best answer there would be A, because you're moving to the left. Emphysema, what will you choose for emphysema here? Emphysema means loss of elasticity, so therefore an increase in compliance. Again, the answer should be A, because an emphysematous lung has an increase in compliance. RDS. RDS, loss of surfactant or not enough production of surfactant. So what will happen? An increase in surface tension force. So now, and also the impact of Laplace law, we would lose compliance. And the best answer there for me is B. Why B and not C? Because I will choose C for atelectasis, which is the end stage of RDS. In atelectasis, I'm having more collapse or end stage of collapse of the lung. This is one way the exam can ask us about doing graphs on compliance.